Hey everybody, this is Miss Peachy from your WCA biology class, and here we are with our kind of instruction here of Unit 5, Lesson 4 in biology. This is inputs and outputs of mitosis. Pretty short lesson as well, but there's a few kind of complex terms in here that I wanted to make sure that I explained with you. Just again, as a reminder, you can download the outline of the lesson. This does not give specific information. This is an outline for you to fill notes in. So I've just kind of give some headings here for you then to include information that we've discussed here in our in our video. So the lesson begins by saying, what happens essentially when you fall and skin your knee. Eventually that skinned knee doesn't just stay skinned, it is replaced, the skin is replaced with fresh new skin. And how does that happen? And of course it happens through that process of mitosis. So again, mitosis, as we see here, a type of cell division in which a parent cell copies itself, resulting in two identical daughter cells. Mitosis is the form of cell division used in all cell growth except sexual reproduction, which we'll talk about that a different time. We'll get into the process of meiosis, which sounds a lot like mitosis, but it is different. So mitosis, cell division, right? But the problem here is that, well, first of all, I just realized here that they point out another term here that I want to make sure that you're familiar with because we're going to use it a lot. It says human cells. Actually, it says during mitosis, one cell duplicates all or part of its genetic information and then splits to form two identical cells where once there had been one. Human cells formed in mitosis are diploid, which means they contain two of each chromosome from one parent. We have actually talked about how your cells contain two copies of each chromosome. One comes from mom, one comes from dad, but we'd never used the term diploid before. I think it's very important that you're very familiar with the word diploid. Diploid, and let me just throw this up on the whiteboard for you. Diploid are cells that have two copies of each chromosome. The opposite of diploid is haploid, which isn't mentioned in this lesson, but you might as well talk about it. These are cells that have only one copy of each chromosome. And in humans and in animals, the only haploid cells that you have in your entire body are your gametic cells, your gametes, the eggs and the sperm are the only haploid cells in your body. In other organisms, for example, like plants, they have the gametophyte, which is part of a plant that contains haploid cells. So they have other types of parts of the plant that are haploid. But in animals, it's just the egg and sperm. So diploid are cells that have two copies of each chromosome, and that's pretty much every cell in your body with the exception of those gametic cells. All right, so moving on here, they kind of talk about differences between eukaryotic cells and other types of cells, mitosis in specific types of cells, some other terms. The parent cell is the cell that divides. The daughter cell is kind of the product of that, so that the next cell that is produced from the parent cell is the daughter cell. But then they give a term that, is new and unfamiliar, and that term is senescence right here. And that is on your study guide as well. So senescence is essentially a cell or a state that the cell enters into when it's no longer able to divide anymore. Essentially, cells can continue to divide and replace themselves for a finite period of time. After a while, that cell becomes too old and may have errors in it and stuff. It kind of becomes more dangerous for it to make a copy of itself because the copy might contain things that aren't necessarily ideal. It's going to keep deteriorating. A great example, and you guys might not be familiar with this, is if you have a copy machine and you make a copy of your original, and then you take the copy and eventually you make a copy of that, and you take your new copy and make a copy of that. Every time you make a copy of the original, you get some a little distortion in the images. This happens with videos too. I think sometimes if you go online and you find videos on YouTube, they're copies of copies of copies, and then the video quality becomes really, really poor over time. That happens with cells as well. So at some point, they can't make copies of themselves anymore, and they said they enter a state of senescence. And senescence means that they are no longer able to copy themselves. Um, and at that point, the lifespan of that cell becomes pretty finite, because then once that cell eventually reaches a point where it is no longer functional, it dies and it can no longer make copies of itself. So some cells become senescent soon after replication. Other cells may continue to replicate for long periods of times before senescence sets in. It just depends on the type of cell we're talking about. So again, our last lesson talked a lot about cell differentiation and the different types of stem cells, your totipotent, pluripotent, and multipotent stem cells. And so they're kind of referred to again here. The differentiation is again when a cell will form into kind of a specific type of cell. So you've kind of got a generic version of the cell that is formed, and then that through different factors can become a different kind of cell. And so what determines kind of what type of cell it becomes? And so that is through something called gene expression. So gene expression is determined by various factors, including things like the environment, the other types of cells that are nearby, and chemical signals within the body. So depending on external clues, the cell will know what type of cell it turns into. The genetics, the genes, the DNA, the little genes that are in the DNA, have like coding within them to respond to environmental factors in different ways. So depends on the environment. Let's see here. So continuing on here, it talks a little bit about another type of, well, it talks about senescence again, essentially. It says, when cells stop replicating, they are considered to have left the cell cycle. Damaged skin cells become senescent, which allows for new stem cells to take their place. You definitely don't want damaged cells to copy themselves, right? And different types of cells either can make copies of themselves or can't, kind of depending on the type of cells. So another thing that says here is, however, not all differentiated cells are able to replicate. Some can replicate, and some can replicate often. Skin cells, blood cells, and cells lining the digestive tract, for example, have a short lifespan and quickly become senescent. Serious health issues would result if damaged cells were able to continue to replicate. So again, you don't want to make like copies of damaged things. Otherwise, every copy thereafter would also be damaged, right? And then finally, another term is brought up, and the term is quiescent or quiescence, and it's kind of the opposite of um, senescence. Ugh, hard for me to say that word. So quiescence is a cell that is able to replicate but isn't actively doing so. So quiescent cells are differentiated cells that can replicate, but they've currently left the cell cycle and are not currently dividing or preparing to divide. So if we remember back to the cell cycle, they would be in that G0 state of the cell cycle. They're not actually in the G1, the S, the G2, or the M phase. They're just kind of like waiting. They're waiting for the need to divide. Perhaps later something will happen that will require them to divide, but at this point they don't need to make copies of themselves. They're still healthy, they're still be able to do their function pretty well. There's no injury that needs to be repaired, there's no growth happening, and so at that point we say the cell is in a state of quiescence. Quiescence meaning that it is still capable of dividing, but it's just not doing it right now. It's just not doing it right at the moment, and that's okay. It might divide later, but it's just not the choice for that cell at this point. It's not really a choice, but there's just, it's not time for that cell to divide. All right, so that's it for this, guys. The two new terms that you learned today were senescence and quiescence, and they sound a lot alike, but senescence means that a cell has reached a point where it's divided enough and it can't do it anymore because it would be dangerous for it to do so. The copies that it would make would be damaged, and so it's just no longer able to divide. And quiescence is a cell that is capable of dividing, but isn't actively doing so at the moment. It's not really in the cell cycle. It's kind of waiting to go into the cell cycle. All right, so that's it for today, ladies and gentlemen. If you have questions, let me know. Otherwise, I will see you guys in the next one.